International news now.
Today, we want to discuss the growing political and military tensions over Taiwan. As Rob noted earlier, this escalation in tensions corresponds with the series of threatening military exercises conducted by China's military, the People's Liberation Army, since the beginning of October. Over the weekend, the respective presidents of China and Taiwan issued public statements reaffirming a foundational political conflict between the two of them over the ultimate political status of Taiwan. So we're going to cover this story in 4 parts. In the first introductory section, we're going to present 2 brief videos to highlight some of the important aspects of this recent escalation of this dispute. We can go ahead and show this slide. The second provides an overview of the overarching political conflict over Taiwan's political status, a conflict that dates to the incomplete termination of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. The third is going to review U.S. actions and interests in this conflict, highlighting the policy of strategic ambiguity and the growing challenges that the United States faces in maintaining this posture in light of China's rise and the larger changes that China appears to be demanding or trying to create to the larger global political order. The fourth section is going to examine the strategic implications of the recent military exercises by China. It's going to talk about what they mean for the distribution of military power in the region, some of the military purposes behind these actions, how they change the distribution of power, and activate what we might think of as a commitment problem that could raise the possibility for future military conflict. All right, so we're going to begin this discussion now with a brief clip from NBC News that ran over the weekend that provides us a good overview. So let's go ahead and run that clip.
Taiwan marked its National Day with flags, fanfare, and defiance. The island's president, Tsai Ing-wen, vowing Taiwan will not be forced to bow to China. Taiwan is standing on the front line of defending democracy, she said. China has long viewed Taiwan as its own national territory. China's President Xi Jinping on Saturday all but declaring it policy. The complete reunification of our country must be and will be realized, he said. China has been pushing that point and tension to historic new highs. In the past week, sending nearly 150 warplanes into Taiwan's air defense zone, forcing Taiwan's fighter jets to scramble, missile systems to deploy.
At some point, there's going to be a miscalculation, and that would be dangerous for the entire region.
U.S. officials say they're concerned by all the provocation here and warn China against hostile pressure.
This is about China increasingly challenging American primacy in this part of the world, but also threatening to displace the values that define us.
Officially, the U.S. doesn't take sides in the dispute over Taiwan, but just approved a $750 million arms sale to the island. There are reports of training, too, with American troops, including a special operations unit, and U.S. Marines said to be stationed on Taiwan for over a year.
Taiwan is now seen as a central issue for President Biden, who will meet with Xi Jinping in a virtual summit before the end of the year. For now, military confrontation over Taiwan probably isn't imminent, but it's also not impossible.
So let's highlight a few parts of this clip that talked about these recent military developments. The first is the recent round of PRC military exercises that were directed against Taiwan. As the video notes, China has directed its Air Force to fly around 150 missions since the start of October that deliberately breached Taiwan's air identification zone. It's important to note that this zone is not an internationally recognized air boundary. Instead, it's a self-proclaimed airspace over the territory of Taiwan, its surrounding territorial waters, and a buffer zone designed to increase the time its Air Force has to respond to potentially hostile military incursions by foreign planes.
So this is important, right? Because officially then, China didn't break some international rules about airspace, right?
Yeah, right, because there isn't an international convention. Basically, governments around the world have proclaimed these air identification zones, generally over neutral territorial waters. And if we go back to that slide, you can see that Taiwan's claim intentionally, there's a line that divides the straits there, the halfway point. Only up to that halfway point is the expectation over this air defense zone. But again, yes, there's not an international agreement. Taiwan has proclaimed this. And so part of the reasons for China's military exercises is to challenge the legitimacy of this air identification zone. Now the slide is going to show the location and that map there of the Chinese flights. And you'll notice that they're concentrated in the southwest region of Taiwan's air defense zone. The pace or the operational tempo of these flights dramatically increased in October. For example, on October 4th, China conducted 56 missions, and this is the highest number of daily flights that it had executed in the last couple of years. Second, we want to highlight here that the video also notes a report from the Wall Street Journal last week, citing anonymous sources in the US government, that the US military has been deploying a small contingent of special forces and Marines to Taiwan since last year to help train Taiwan's military, principally in preparation to defend it against a future attack by the People's Liberation Army. This is a significant change in US.
Big deal.
Yeah, this is a big deal in US policy. While small, this contingent of US troops is small, the deployment of troops to Taiwan helps to signal to the mainland increasing US military support for Taiwan. The mainland subsequently criticized the actions that had been reported in the media and demanded that the US stop military contact with Taiwan. Now, third, these events reinforce a growing concern in the United States that such military exercises are not just a signal from the Chinese government that simply restates its opposition to Taiwan's political independence. Instead, these actions are increasingly viewed as training missions for the eventual military attack on Taiwan to forcibly reintegrate it into China. Last spring, in March of 2021, Admiral Philip Davidson, the head of the Indo-Pacific Command in the US Navy, gave some testimony to Congress that got a lot of attention. He put a timetable on a coming military conflict in the region, arguing that there could be war between China and Taiwan, likely to involve the United States in the next 6 years. And so where that clip ended, where the reporters tried to, in a sense, add some sobriety to this escalation of military tension, saying that we don't see conflict as likely in the short term, but partly the political debate in the United States has been shaped now by that testimony given by Davidson, I think, in that there's now a window that's being debated in the United States. We don't have to worry about this in the next couple of months, but at some point, and when I was prepping for this story, you can see conversations about the 2024 elections in Taiwan. The US elections would also be important there. So there's this kind of 5 to 10 year window that's starting to shape the public debate.
So it's not a timetable as for the United States to start a war. It's just to make this clear, it's a timetable that when the United States expects China to actually take that step of forcibly integrating
I don't even
Taiwan.
know if I would say expects, but is worried that there's an increasing likelihood that China would do this. And that, these windows are starting to shape the larger policy debates. And partly, and as we'll talk about later on in this session, these opinions are shaped by the clear public statements on the part of the Chinese leadership, specifically President Xi, proclaiming the foundational importance of the reintegration of Taiwan. This isn't a bluff, right? This is a foundational national interest.
And there is a difference here, and it's mostly surrounding the person of President Xi, because the Chinese has always had a policy that Taiwan is the Communist Party of China has always had a policy that Taiwan is part of mainland China. And they always have said that eventually it will get reincorporated into the Chinese state. The difference is that Xi is really an important kind of once-in-a-lifetime leader of China, and he sees himself that way. And there's a lot, I mean, the stories I've read is there's a lot of speculation around, like, he wants to do this as a kind of capstone to his time as ruler of China. And that's part of what's leading to these sorts of projections, is that, you know, he's not young, and so he's going to be around for as long as, you know, forever, for as long as he lives probably, but he wants to have this as part of his legacy.
Yes, and it's important here to emphasize and reinforce what Rob just said. Prior presidents of China displayed a willingness to, in some senses, kick the can down the road, where they said, we want eventual unification of Taiwan, but they were also hesitant to risk a broader confrontation with the United States. And it looks like, as the clip suggested, that China might be more willing to run these risks now to achieve this political goal. Yes. All right, so next we want to run a clip that discusses the public statements made by the presidents of China and Taiwan over the weekend. So go ahead and run that clip now.
The complete reunification of our country must be and can be realized.
China's President Xi Jinping vowed on Saturday to realize reunification with Taiwan. Speaking at Beijing's Great Hall of the People, Xi said the Chinese people have a glorious tradition of opposing separatism. Xi's comments follow a week of tensions, during which Beijing dispatched about 150 Chinese military flights into Taiwan's air defense zone. While he didn't mention the use of force, Xi's message was clear.
Taiwan independence is the greatest obstacle to national reunification and a serious hidden danger to national rejuvenation. Those who forget their heritage, betray their motherland, and seek to split the country will come to no good. And they will be spurned by the people and condemned by history.
His speech has not been well received in Taiwan. Taipei, in response, called on Beijing to abandon its coercion and said its future rested in the hands of the people. The island, which broke away from the mainland in 1949, rejects Beijing's claims of sovereignty and has its own democratically elected government. In Xi's last major speech on Taiwan in July, he vowed to, quote, smash any attempts at formal independence. In 2019, he directly threatened to use force to bring the island under Beijing's control.
Okay, so we want to highlight a few things from this clip. First, there is a fundamental political conflict between China and Taiwan over the political status of Taiwan. The leader of China, Xi Jinping, publicly reaffirmed a national interest for his country in the formal reintegration of Taiwan into China. And he also called the government of Taiwan a separatist government, implying that its actions pose a threat to the integrity, the territorial integrity of China. And so the next slide shows a couple of prominent quotes from the speech by President Xi. Let me just read those through. Taiwanese independence is the biggest obstacle to achieving the reunification of the motherland and the most serious danger to national rejuvenation. And the second one is, no one should underestimate the Chinese people's staunch determination, firm will, and strong ability to defend national sovereignty and territorial integrity of China, is what he's talking about. The complete reunification of the motherland must be fulfilled and will definitely be fulfilled. And so it's important to note that the language in this speech changed from prior ones he has given in the past year. And it's actually less aggressive, which is, you know, if you read those, it sounded plenty aggressive, but he's taken a step back. It talked about a peaceful reunification of Taiwan rather than specifically and deliberately threatening the use of military force to integrate Taiwan as he had done in the last year. So some people have been viewing this speech as a partial attempt at de-escalation of the conflict. But this change in tone shouldn't obscure the existence of a larger political conflict. The government of Xi Jinping has repeatedly and publicly stated that Taiwan is part of China and that it will eventually be reintegrated into China. Accordingly, this speech has important domestic and international implications. It is expressing an expectation of significant political change in Taiwan's future, and that change would have huge, repercussions for the whole region and for the international political economy, as well as the fate of democracy in Asia. I mean,
let's think about these implications here, right? This formal public statements like this, when they create expectations on the part of the public about some future policy change, they also become a vehicle by which to measure and evaluate a leader's performance according to whether or not they achieve this goal. And so when President Xi goes out and lays these markers down, he also exposes himself to domestic punishment if he doesn't fulfill these obligations.
Even though China doesn't have a democratic system, his punishment is less than democratic leaders because he doesn't face re-election.
No, but I mean,
but it does have an effect.
Yeah, well, and I mean punishment in terms of what happens within the Chinese Communist Party, and if there's an overthrow or punishment within the party to elect, or to, rather than say elect, to select different leaders, right? And so this isn't, even though China is an authoritarian regime, this pressure is still significant, right? In terms of creating expectations by which the public, whether we want to define the public more broadly in China or include the public just to include Communist Party members, by which they're going to evaluate him. And so if he fails to achieve this objective in the next 4 or 5 years, it can threaten the legitimacy of his rule.
It does him a lot of it has a political upside for him too, in the sense that it plays to a nationalist sentiment in China that will help his power, prestige, and popularity. And he could use that because there's some other issues within China that he's grappling with on the economic side, on COVID and everything else. But these kind of statements will help bolster the sort of national unity that he's looking at. And so that's the Chinese side. So let's talk about Taiwan, right? And so unsurprisingly, Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan, reaffirmed the will of Taiwan's government to resist Chinese efforts at integration in a series of public speeches over the weekend. And so she had some noteworthy quotes too, right, that are on the slide. And so let me read that one through. She said, "We will continue to bolster our national defense and demonstrate our determination to defend ourselves in order to ensure that nobody can force Taiwan to take the path that China has laid out for us. This is because the path that China has laid out offers neither a free and democratic way of life for Taiwan, nor sovereignty for our 23 million people." And this is important because it ties into this, identification with democracy as well as sovereignty. So you're going to pick that up from
let's highlight a couple things here. First is Taiwan's leaders are intentionally careful about stating their political goals. And in this case, she claims sovereignty, but is careful not to proclaim independence. And the public affirmation of support or claiming of independence on the part of a Taiwanese government, in the past, China has said this is a red line. If you cross it, we will defend our interests with military force. And so Taiwan's government is very careful not to publicly proclaim independence. One of the concerns about go ahead.
Great. But this is kind of semantic, right? I mean, because the difference between independence and sovereignty is...
It's semantic.
It's semantic. It's minimal, if not nothing, right?
Yes. Well, and partly, one of the concerns is, right, when you have formally recognized independence, then other countries are participating in this. And so in terms of
declare independence,
then this would put pressure on other governments to recognize Taiwan, and China is trying to avoid that. So this has always been one of the things in the background of domestic politics in Taiwan, because you have some groups and some members of the DPP, which is the ruling party right now, that say, let's just proclaim independence. China, let's dare China to launch a war against us because we don't believe that that's a credible threat. There is some concern that the potential next president in Taiwan after the elections of 2024 is more likely to be willing to publicly proclaim independence. And as a result, this is used to understand maybe this is why China is escalating the situation, because things could come to a head in the next couple of years.
To deter a development in an election.
Yeah, right. Because this is also what's going right. These military exercises are also designed to signal to the domestic public in Taiwan. This is a two-level game, after all, going on. Be careful about moving too close to independence, because you might then force us being China, to go to war against you. And partly, right, when President Xi creates these expectations about reintegration, if Taiwan declares independence and China doesn't do anything, then the PRC is going to look bad to the Chinese Communist Party and to the domestic public in China. And so it's a challenge for both sides. Another thing that Rob mentioned we want to emphasize here in President Tsai's speech in Taiwan is this assertion of a democratic identity. And why is this so important, particularly in the context of Taiwan's relationship with the United States? Because Biden has been so clear in pronouncing support for democracies and a league of democracies and multilateral cooperation with other democracies around the world. What President Tsai is doing is, in a sense, proclaiming membership in this larger global community of democracies and hoping to create an expectation, or at least make it politically harder on, say, President Biden to abandon Taiwan in the future if he didn't do anything. And then the last thing we just want to emphasize here is that, again, there are clear national interests expressed by the Taiwanese government that are strongly opposed to China, with China's demand to reintegrate Taiwan.
Well, they look at even the status of Hong Kong and see that this would really change things in Taiwan economically, politically, socially. And then if it was done with military force, it would destroy that country. I mean, and so this is for any of these actors, the highest stakes is for Taiwan. Taiwan will suffer the most if some kind of action to change the status quo is taken. So, okay, so now we want to move to the second part of our discussion that focuses explicitly on the longstanding conflict between China and Taiwan. And Taiwan, and this is about that strange political status of Taiwan, and we want to kind of give you some historical context of this. So Taiwan exists in a weird, ambiguous political status in which it is effectively an independent, sovereign, democratic country that is also a quasi-ally of the United States. And the key term here is effectively. It's not officially that, because they don't declare independence and the United States doesn't recognize them as an independent state. And so most countries in the world do not recognize Taiwan as an independent state in the international system with full sovereignty. And this includes the United States. The United States does not have an official ambassador to Taiwan. Taiwan is not a member of the United Nations, right? And being a member of the United Nations is a really firm signal that you're a sovereign country, part of the international community. And so this odd status of Taiwan as, in practice, day-to-day, kind of a sovereign state, but officially not, is an artifact of the currently unresolved Chinese Civil War that ended more than 70 years ago in 1949 with the nationalist government of China, which lost that civil war in mainland China to the Communist Party, fleeing to Taiwan to set up a rival government there, okay? So remember, we talked about this development in our unit on, we're going to. But we are going to discuss this, but the victory of the Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War was a big loss for the United States in the early stages of the Cold War. And in the final stages of World War II, the United States government, before the Communist Party in China won, it hoped that the nationalist government in China would serve to win that civil war and then serve as a check on Soviet power in Asia, right? And so this was a big setback for U.S. goals right after World War II. So after 1949, what did the United States do? It did not recognize the new communist regime in Beijing, right? And instead recognized the nationalist government that was now in Taiwan as the rightful government over all of China, right? And in the aftermath of the Korean War, the United States developed strong ties with the nationalist government in Taiwan during the first couple decades of the Cold War and just had no official relationship with communist China. So that was the status quo in the first couple decades of the Cold War, right? But then President Richard Nixon changed this by reorienting U.S. policy toward China, mainland China. And he sensed an opportunity that was created by the emerging split between China and the Soviet Union, both communist countries but having very different interests. And this split was emerging in the 1960s. And Nixon then took some action to help leverage that split for U.S. interests in the Cold War and its containment policy of the Soviet Union. And so Nixon went to China, and he eventually worked out a deal that recognized officially the communist government in China and improved relations between the United States and China in order to have China as an actor that the United States had a relationship with in order to limit Soviet influence in Asia. Now, that move had a lot of positive consequences in terms of economic relations with China that has now blossomed after many decades into a real tight relationship in the global economy. A lot of economic growth in China, but also benefits for the U.S. economy. But one of the costs, and there were several costs of this shift, was a reorientation in U.S. policy away from its close ties with Taiwan. And so since that change in policy toward China and the recognized of Communist Party in China as the rightful government of China, the United States has adopted a policy of strategic ambiguity relative to the political status of Taiwan. And so this policy is designed to leave open the possibility that the United States might come to Taiwan's aid if it was attacked by China, but it also reinforces and the United States reinforces this idea that it will come to the defense of Taiwan with significant arms exports to that country, to Taiwan. But at the same time, the United States does not want Taiwan to believe that it would come to its aid with 100% certainty under all and any circumstances in a conflict. And now, why would the United States, if it wants Taiwan not to be reincorporated into China, have that kind of ambiguous policy? Well, the United States worries that a really unambiguous, strong commitment to the defense of Taiwan might encourage the government of Taiwan to destabilize the uneasy but peaceful equilibrium between Taiwan and China by declaring independence, political independence from China. And so the government in China has classified Taiwan as a renegade breakaway province that should be reintegrated into the mainland. It pressures other states, including the United States, not to recognize Taiwan's independence. And President Xi of China has publicly declared that unification of the two will eventually occur. The Chinese government has also repeatedly reaffirmed its intention to launch a war against Taiwan and to conquer it if the government of Taiwan unilaterally declares independence. More broadly, the primary source of political conflict is the ultimate political status of Taiwan. Is it part of China? And if so, how much political independence should it have? That's the central question. The United States has had this policy of strategic ambiguity because its overriding interest on this issue is the preservation of peace. It does not want a war to break out between China and Taiwan. It wants both sides to refrain from unilaterally altering the status quo. And it tries not to take a position on what Taiwan's ultimate political status should be in order to maintain this status quo. So what does the United States do? It pivots back and forth between the two sides, between China and between Taiwan, if it believes that either one of them is about to unilaterally try to change the status quo. So that's the strategic ambiguity policy there. And so we're going to watch a video now from Bloomberg that provides some additional background, historical background on this political conflict. And so let's run that now.
Alongside this economic shift, Taiwan's political landscape also changed dramatically. Under the rule of the Chinese Nationalist Party, or KMT, for 4 decades Taiwan was an authoritarian regime until the end of martial law in the late 1980s. Then Taiwan gradually transitioned to democracy. The first direct presidential elections took place in 1996, followed by several peaceful transfers of power.
So the Democratic Progressive Party is the current party that governs Taiwan. They were a party that came out of this movement of activists pushing for more democracy in Taiwan in the 1970s. And their fundamental stance is that Taiwan is already an independent country.
But this isn't the same stance held by Beijing.
大陆和台湾同属一个中国的事实从未改变。一个中国原则是两岸关系的政治基础。
So from the People's Republic of China, the PRC's perspective, Taiwan remains the last piece of an unfinished civil war. It's an illegitimate regime. It's a breakaway territory that needs to be unified with the motherland. The Chiang Kai-shek regime won a reprieve in June 1950 when the Korean War broke out. The United States then stepped in to prevent a final Chinese Communist Party, CCP-led invasion of the island of Taiwan. The United States has been there ever since as the guarantor of Taiwan's security.
Despite this guarantee of security, in 1979 the US broke ties with the Republic of China on Taiwan and established them with the People's Republic of China in Beijing.
Here things get complicated. The United States, in one of our communiques with the People's Republic of China, acknowledged the PRC position that Taiwan was part of China, but the United States also did not accept the PRC claim to Taiwan. That has been our position ever since, and so in effect, the US views Taiwan's status as undetermined.
But even after 1979, they have maintained informal relations with Taiwan and continued to invest here, continued to support the economy, and have most importantly continued to sell arms to Taiwan.
With the US in the middle, China and Taiwan have avoided war for over 7 decades, but tensions between the two sides have risen in recent years.
All right, so let's have some summarizing contents from this and then we'll move on to the next section. The first is let's recognize this one China policy, which is the United States recognized that there is one China, but it doesn't recognize how the mainland government defines what one China should be. Right. And the United States, its position is that this should be negotiated between the two entities. Neither side should unilaterally alter or change the status quo. And this one China could mean that, and that opens up the possibility that this one China thing could mean different things. It could mean one China is defined in cultural terms.
Right.
Or it could be defined in economic terms. It doesn't have to be defined in political terms, which would necessarily require the integration of Taiwan into China. But the US position is the status is undetermined,
right,
subject to negotiation between the two sides.
And that's how if it's ever going to change, it should change through negotiation.
Peaceful negotiation.
Peaceful negotiation, and not China just militarily taking over Taiwan.
Yeah.
Or Taiwan unilaterally declaring independence and expecting the United States to enforce that.
Yeah.
So that's the strategic ambiguity of it.
And it's important to recognize here, where did this shift in reorientation in US policy towards China and Taiwan emerge? It emerged, it's an artifact of the Cold War.
Right.
And the opportunity that emerged because of the split between China and the Soviet Union for the United States to insert itself into that split, to develop better ties with mainland China, to then offset the Soviet threat. Well, guess what? The Soviet threat is gone.
Right.
And now the overarching strategic considerations of the United States are on China, which implies and is starting to create expectations that the US is then going to alter, right, its relationship and potentially shift closer to Taiwan. You were going to
Right. Well, I was just going to say that this strategic ambiguity wasn't always in place with the establishment of Taiwan as the entity for the nationalist government and mainland China as the communist regime. Right after that happened, the United States had official relations with Taiwan and didn't recognize communist China. And then that changed when President Nixon decided it's in our interest to have formal relations with mainland China. And in the process, he basically broke off formal relations with Taiwan and then created this sort of middle ground where we are no longer officially, recognizing the government of Taiwan as any sort of legitimate government for all of China. That was our stance before. But then we also wanted to leave in place some sort of, we don't want China to just take over Taiwan because that'd be bad for our interests. So that's where it lies.
And it's important to recognize that this larger reorientation in the international system that's accommodating China's rise is creating pressure on U.S. presidents, both Democrat and Republican. We are seeing these larger strategic debates in the United States that are challenging this long-term posture of strategic ambiguity, and increasingly arguments saying that the U.S. should abandon strategic ambiguity and move closer to Taiwan are gaining more headway in public policy debates. And we can view, for example, the Wall Street Journal story of last week that has sources saying that the U.S. has deployed a small number of troops to Taiwan as indicative of this shift. And we can also read Chinese military displays in the last couple of weeks as a signal to the U.S. government, be careful of moving closer to Taiwan. We don't want to see growing support for Taiwan because this is going to put pressure on us to act. Right. And so we've seen public statements there's going to be a summit, an online virtual summit between President Xi and President Biden, trying to tamp down and recognizing that this is a dangerous situation that could get destabilized. All right, so in the final section of our segment today, we want to highlight the political consequences and implications of these most recent military actions. As we mentioned, there's an important signaling game going on here in which the Chinese government is signaling a growing impatience with a status quo that leaves Taiwan as effectively, if not formally, independent. Moreover, the growth of its military capabilities is enhancing its political ability to extract new concessions in the region, potentially from Taiwan and the United States, with the hope of altering Taiwan's political status. But as we discussed last week, these military changes can help activate a commitment problem, whereby a rising power, China in this case, makes new demands that are commensurate with its military capabilities. But this dynamism in the distribution of military power could destabilize the existing peace by potentially creating incentives to launch a preventive war, or alternative dynamics that could give rise to a war through miscalculation, whereby the repeated escalation of a series of military crises unleashes a war that neither side wants. So to explore these possibilities, we first want to provide some more background on these military developments, get into the details a little bit more on the operations and the military balance of power in the region. To do so, we're going to watch a recent clip from CNN that features Professor Sheena Greitens from the LBJ School of Public Policy here at UT. And I want to say before we go to this clip, if you're interested more on China and Taiwan, go follow her Twitter feed. There's tons of good commentary and sources on this evolving relationship between China and Taiwan. So let's go ahead and run that clip.
What's China's endgame here, and how should the West respond? Sheena Greitens is an expert on East Asia and U.S. national security, and she's also an associate professor at my alma mater, the University of Texas, and she's joining me now from Austin. Sheena, welcome to the program. So we heard from Taiwan's president today in this op-ed, and she wrote, Beijing has never abandoned its ambitions towards Taiwan. Beijing is replacing, however, its commitment to a peaceful resolution with an increasingly aggressive posture. So why is China doing this now, and what is it trying to get out of it?
Thanks, Bianna. It's great to be on with you, and hi from Austin. Over the weekend, what we saw is that China sent a large number of planes into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. And an air defense identification zone is a space around the island of Taiwan that extends beyond national airspace. National airspace actually only extends about 12 miles from Taiwan's coastline. And so a lot of countries choose to have an air defense identification zone, which is larger, to give the country and the military time to respond to incoming foreign aircraft if they need to. And what was concerning about the planes that China sent was the number. It was actually more in 4 days than the entire previous month. But also the specific type of planes. There were some planes that typically don't do these kinds of flights that we've seen in the past, and the timing. So they're practicing doing these flights at night. What that suggests is that China is practicing and trying to gain some very specific military advantages by conducting these types of operations. And there are 3 or 4 things that they would get out of doing this on the military part, and then there's also a sort of political signaling logic here. So on the military part, China is probably testing Taiwan's reaction. It's seeing, how good are they at monitoring planes that are coming into the air defense identification zone? How quick are they to respond? And what is the response when China sends different types of planes and different combinations of planes? So testing Taiwan's response is one. Second, China's practicing coordinating its own air forces. So China's had a very rapid military buildup. Its pilots are still learning how to do complex operations at increasingly greater distances from bases. And so they just need the practice in a very pragmatic military sense. Third is that this is really expensive for Taiwan to respond to, both the fuel costs, it's hard on the pilots. And remember, China has about 1,500 fighters. Taiwan only has about 400, and a lot of those planes are older. So this also just really wears down and wears out Taiwan's ability to defend itself. So one reason why China's doing that is just that there are some really concrete military benefits to this kind of increased operational tempo. It puts a lot of pressure on.
So let me highlight a few things from this, and we want to focus our discussion on the military consequences of these displays and these flights in the last couple of weeks. And a couple of things that have been noted in commentaries. Highlight the training at night. Why is that significant? Because this is practice, and the expectation is that an initial invasion would occur at night. So conducting the training operations at night, they look like preparation for war. She talks about the coordination of activities among the different components of the PLA for these types of operations. So this is a training mission. They're learning, practicing about how to execute initial components of a strike against Taiwan. This is an important signal in and of its own right. The other thing that she notes is they're also learning, trying to figure out how the Taiwan air defense systems are going to respond to these incursions, with the idea that this is going to tell something to them about how Taiwan might respond in the initial stages of a conflict, and also what Taiwan's allies might do as well. So this is revealing, this is an intentional set of military operations that are revealing and training about, well, they're revealing what might happen in the first stages of a conflict, but they also suggest that there's a real training, and she talks about increasing the operational tempo. So this is significant in the sense that this is creating the conditions that are helping to shift at least the tactical distribution of military power in the Straits, right? Increasing potentially all these training and operational missions, potentially increasing China's ability to secure military victories, at least in the initial stages of a conflict. So this video was from last week before the developments over the weekend. I also want to point out that yesterday on Monday, the PLA announced that it had conducted amphibious assault operations on its southeast coastline. It was unclear when these assaults were practiced, but the implication also was that's also part of preparation to attack Taiwan. Again, larger signals being sent out about we are ramping up our preparation to actually impose a military settlement on this conflict. And so this is significant, right? Shifting the local distribution of power potentially between the two sides. And that's designed then to reinforce new, political demands that would ultimately alter Taiwan's political status. And we know that these shifts in the distribution of power create expectations about the demand for new concessions and can then heighten the risks of war. Again, and this is what we talked about with respect to the logic of the commitment problem. One other thing, note what she says about the distribution of military capabilities in the region. Between China and Taiwan, 1,500 planes for the PLA, 400 for Taiwan, but they're outdated. Significant imbalance in the distribution of military power, which implies that the defense of Taiwan, if it were to be successful, would probably need some type of American support. We got one more small clip. Let's run.
Well, I think it is for domestic consumption, but I also think you're right that this is about a changing China's role and place in the world, and specifically a vision that Xi Jinping has of putting China at the center of the world stage. So yes, you're right that this did take place over probably the closest equivalent that the PRC has to the 4th of July. So it's a national holiday, patriotism. I've been in China during this week. And patriotism is on sort of full display. It's at a very, it's running very high. There's often a military parade where new military hardware is displayed. And so, that domestic context is part of this. But yeah, Xi Jinping unquestionably has taken China in a direction that is much more repressive at home, the crackdown on tech, but also in Xinjiang, in Tibet, and in general on religious and ethnic minorities and citizens more broadly with the buildup of the surveillance state. But along with being more repressive at home, China's also become increasingly assertive abroad. And we see that at China's periphery, not just with Taiwan, but you're right, with Hong Kong and with the really rapid sort of national securitization and making Hong Kong into a national security bastion for the CCP, as well as things like the territory that's disputed with Japan, the South China Sea, and China's role in international institutions, where China is increasingly trying to rewrite the rules of global governance to favor China's interests and to legitimate its system of authoritarian governance, including by delegitimating Western democracies like the United States and our allies in.
Okay, I want to finish with a couple points here that reinforce, in some senses, what do these military exercises tell us about potentially what are China's broader interests in the world? And this tells us something about the rise of China. And Professor Greitens notes and says that I think these actions reflect Xi Jinping's broader vision of the world, in which China's power is rising, and because it's rising, it wants some renegotiation, or it wants to alter the larger international status quo. And we're seeing this in the South China Sea. She notes territorial disputes in Japan, the changed political status of Hong Kong, and now the demand for new changes, or we should say ongoing or an escalation of the pressure to fulfill long-standing claims to integrate Taiwan into China. And so what we're seeing here is the logic of the commitment problem that we discussed last week, and the challenges associated with preserving peace. Peace requires the participants in a political dispute to uphold their obligations within the peace settlement, to not make new demands on each other, to revise the political status quo. Peace gets destabilized, or we worry about the risks of war, when a rising power all of a sudden finds that it's not in its interests to honor prior obligations and to press other countries for revisions. That's what we're seeing right now. Right? And so accordingly, we can see how the rise of China is potentially destabilizing, in that it's creating new demands for revisions to the larger political order. And this heightens the risk of war. We don't want to say that war is coming or anything like that. There's lots of opportunity for settlements, but these are some of the challenges that the United States and Taiwan now faces, which is, okay, if we make a concession to China, will China be satisfied? Or will it then use those concessions to demand new concessions in the future? The other thing I want to emphasize here, and we can see this larger challenge to the global political order, and she notes that part of this posture by the mainland is also challenging the existing international order by trying to delegitimize democracy.
Right.
Both in Taiwan and in the United States, and highlighting some of the shortcomings, say, of the ability of democracy in the United States to deal with the COVID crisis, and maintaining what China was highly critical of the United States after January 6th, maintaining political stability and open participation in the United States. And so those challenges of democratic rule are also about challenging the larger international order.
And they noted the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the relative failure of the United States in 20 years to remake Afghanistan. I mean, all of these things have a cumulative effect, and it reinforces China's sort of confidence, if you will, in challenging the informal rules that are in existence and have been in existence for a very long time prior to China's rise. And it's like, he's thinking, why should China continue to tolerate an effectively independent Taiwan when it's so strong now?
Yep.
That's what's, and that redistribution of military power is what causes these commitment problems. They want a different deal.
Yep.